Life Management Science Labs would like to acknowledge that we live and produce this podcast on the traditional lands of the Wurundjeri people. We'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands of our listeners and our international colleagues. We'd like to pay our respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Aging Less, the Longevity Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. We are champions of life management science, providing structured insights informed by science and inspired by practice on key aspects of conscious living. Each week, we bring you scientific and practical insights on each element with the expert knowledge of professionals in the field. I'm your host, Marie Stella, coming to your ears from Naarm, Melbourne, Australia. Let's learn together.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the show. Our brain is the center of our thoughts, bodily functions, and every aspect in the human body. How can we maximize our brain and its usage? We often drink coffee to wake our body, drink alcohol for fun. But what is truly the long-term effect of such substances on our brain? Today, we are accompanied by Andrew Scholey, Professor of Human Psychopharmacology based in Melbourne, Australia, with affiliations at Monash and Swinburne Universities. Lead investigator on a series of groundbreaking studies into natural substances and neurocognition. He will lead us in today's discussion. Welcome to the show, Andrew. Andrew?
Hi, Sabrina.
Sorry for that. Yeah. So, Andrew, before we begin, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes, so I'm a professor of human psychopharmacology. So I study the way in which what we ingest or take into the body affects the brain and our mood and cognition. I'm currently based in Melbourne, as you said. I'm about to move to the UK in about 4 weeks for an academic position there. And I got my PhD in 1991. So I've spent whatever that is, 30 or so years studying the effect of various substances on the brain. But I'm particularly interested in the ways in which we can improve brain function and protect our brain with aging. And that's led to a number of studies looking at what I call interventions. So that's nutrition, whole diet, specific nutrients, and extracts from usually from plant sources. So what we loosely call botanicals.
I see, and I also have seen that you have a really extensive research on the nutra and the substances that we put into our bodies, along with natural ingredients. What are everyday substances or ingredients that we often look at lightly and we should actually be looking at?
Yeah, really, pretty much all foods have the potential to change mood and cognitive function. You mentioned caffeine, that's an obvious one, but there are other components of tea, for example. If we think about a morning ritual, what we eat for breakfast can have an effect on our cognition during the morning, particularly the extent to which foods release sugar or glucose into the bloodstream. And particularly at the moment, there's a lot of interest in the beneficial effects of healthy foods, fruit and vegetables, whole foods, as opposed to the deleterious effect of things like ultra-processed foods.
Indeed. And what kind of food do you think we should be taking more or ingesting more?
There's a lot of evidence for what's called the Mediterranean diet, which I'm sure people will have heard of. So this is a diet which is very rich in fruit and vegetables, very little processed food, so whole grain pastas. But a really good rule of thumb is if you can eat as many kind of multicolored foods. So this idea of eating the rainbow actually has some science behind it. Foods which are brightly colored are packed with what we call flavonoids. They give the fruit the
colors.
color. And these flavonoids are known to be very good for systemic health, so the health of the whole body, including the brain.
I see, because a lot of the times we think that veggies are green, and nowadays it's actually even better to eat the rainbow.
Exactly.
And yeah, that's really incredible. But before we go any further, I'd love to get to know you. And here's a segment we call Have You Met Andrew? So, Andrew, first question: what is your favorite book?
Um, I think historically it was probably 1984 by George Orwell.
Yeah.
But more recently, I've just read a fantastic book called The Trading Game by Gary Stevenson, which is more of a non-fiction book, but I'd highly recommend it.
I have read 1984, so I'm going to try to read the second one. And what movie have you enjoyed recently?
Um, I really enjoyed the Bob Dylan documentary,
Ah,
um, A Complete Unknown. But last year, I think was a bumpy year. I'm a bit of a cinemaphile, and I thought 2024 was a fantastic year for films. I particularly enjoyed Poor Things, the Emma Stone film, which was
Poor
I just thought
Things.
very, very clever.
Incredible. And are you listening to any podcasts at the moment?
I I love podcasts. I listen to a lot of podcasts at the moment. I'm listening to a lot of podcasts which are trying to understand the psychology of why people hold very different views, including things like conspiracy theories. So
Oh,
there's a podcast called Things Fell Apart by John Ronson, which is really excellent. Decoding the Gurus is another really good one. Mariana in Conspiracy Land. I highly recommend them
I
all.
see more into conspiracy theories, I see.
I'm not into conspiracy theories, but I'm into trying to understand
Why?
why people get sucked into them. Yes,
Yeah, it is really something that a lot of people do fall into, and it is quite intriguing why people are very much interested in those. And do you have any role model?
not really a role model as such. There are certainly a lot of people who I admire. I mean, I've certainly sort of had my heroes over the years. Certain musicians. I'm a big fan of singer-songwriters like Elvis Costello would be one, Nick Cave to some degree, and people like Carl Sagan, who was a scientist and a science popularizer. I was a big fan of his. Yeah.
Yeah. A lot of big names, a lot of big names. And I understand that you have been in the industry for a while, but is there a course that has inspired you that you may remember?
Um, Actually, it's quite interesting. My degree was in psychology, and my first love was always psychology.
Oh,
Certainly, personally, I got much more interested in the psychobiological aspects, the kind of physiology of how the brain works and ways in which the brain sort of, we can get the brain to give up its secrets, which isn't that easy. But I've always had a real fondness for social
mm,
psychology, and so I do remember some of those classic experiments in social psych that were described during my degree, which were things like just dividing people up into groups at random, and how that formed this kind of in-group, out-group. And we can see that happening a lot, I think, at the societal level at the moment, and it helps to understand why people become quite tribal about what they believe and don't believe, and the kind of people they like, particularly with the internet, I think, at the moment. So probably social psychology would be the short answer.
social psychology is really something that is quite different to what you are pursuing right now, which is neurocognition.
Absolutely.
And what brings you to neurocognition in the end?
I think there were some personal reasons. My grandmother, when I was growing up, had suffered from dementia, which my father died of dementia just at the end of 2023. And so prior to that, I had a kind of personal interest in trying to understand the brain processes that were involved in that cognitive decline and dementia, I always had a kind of, I've always been a little bit arty, I guess, or I certainly was when I was a teenager and growing up. So I wasn't sure whether I wanted to pursue music or a career more in academia. And I think during my degree, I just became much more interested in the neurocognitive side of things, how the brain works from that discipline. And so I just, it was something that I felt I could understand quite well, and maybe in a little bit better than some of my peers who were much better at things like, say, statistics, which I was never great at. So I think that was it. Just trying to understand the brain and brain processes.
Yeah, and talking about brain and brain processes and how you have been researching on the neurocognition, how would you define longevity for starters?
Longevity is just living well for longer. Cognitive longevity is being able to keep one's faculties for as long as possible. When we talk about cognition, I think people have a rough idea what it is. It's really all mental processes. So it's memory, attention, and there are many different ways in which we can divide up cognition as a broad area. Really, the one that I tend to use is we have attention, which is just focusing on something. We have what's called working memory, which is where you hold information in mind. So if you're using two-factor authentication is a great example.
Yeah.
So you're on an app. It says, we sent this code to your phone. You open the text. You've got this usually a 6-digit number, which is good for working memory because working memory is 7 plus or minus 2 bits of information. You hold that number in mind. So that's when you're using your working memory. If you don't cheat, you go back to the original app and type in the number. So working memory is where you hold things in mind. Then there's something called secondary memory, which is where you recall events
From the past
in your life or facts which are stored, but then you can sort of pull them out of that store. And then there's executive function, which is involved in things like what we call higher order processes, like planning, like being able to switch from one task to another, and also what we call response inhibition, which we'll probably talk about a little bit in the context of alcohol if we get to that. But response inhibition is inhibiting inappropriate responses, and that might not be like, an outburst. It can just be, okay, I need to not use this process in order to do this task sort of successfully.
I see. So like a filter that has been missing after drinking alcohol. And secondarily, how would you define brain?
The brain is this lump of about 1.5 kilograms of matter in the head. It sort of marches to the same tune as all our other tissue, but it's unique in that it contains something like 80 to 85 billion neurons, and these are very specialized cells which are involved in communication, in communication within the brain. In other words, they carry information in the form of chemical and electrical messages around the brain. And in addition to that, there are areas of the brain which are specialized for different functions. So, for example, we've got a very important area of the brain called the hippocampus, which is sort of quite deep in the brain, which is involved in memory formation. The outer area of the brain, the cortex. So the cortex means bark. So it's like a bark of a tree, but in this case, it's the outer area of the brain, which is involved in processing information. The front of the brain, was the last bit of the brain to evolve and is
The
involved in
frontal
sort of these
cortex.
executive higher functions. And then perhaps surprisingly, visual processing, which you might think occurs, at the front, right behind the eyes, is actually processed in the occipital lobe at the back of the brain. So
I see.
those are a few examples. Yeah.
You did mention a little bit about the frontal part of the brain, and I just want to ask whether is it true that our prefrontal cortex develops when we reach the age of 25?
Well, there is, it's certainly not fully developed during adolescence. So that's true. And so there's a little bit of controversy as to when it's finally developed, but probably, 25 is pretty much fixed. Although it's also interesting that when I did my degree back in the Dark Ages, there was this idea that we're pretty much born with all the neurons, all the brain cells that we're going to have for, we've got them for life. And that was dogma. There was this whole idea that it was not questioned at all. And certainly over the last decade or two, there's much more evidence that we can grow new connections, definitely, and almost certainly new brain cells. So there's a process called neurogenesis, which occurs in the hippocampus, in this area that's really important in memory formation, and also, probably one other area, the area that's involved in smell. Bizarrely, I don't know if that's evolutionary throwback to mammals developing, where the sense of smell is very important. But so the brain continues. Structurally, it probably does get fixed, in the 20s, but then we do know that there are certain activities which can stimulate neurogenesis, so the birth of new neurons. And actually, the most effective way of doing this is through aerobic exercise. So there's growing evidence that aerobic exercise can stimulate the birth of new neurons. So it has lots of good effects in terms of, obviously, it's good for physical fitness, but it's also very good for mental fitness, if you like.
I see. And what is the relationship? We did talk a little bit about the brain health and how we can improve that. But what is the relationship between the neurocognitive health or the brain health with our longevity?
Well, there are two aspects of that. It's a really, really good question. One is about aging successfully. So there's definitely, if you look at the population as a whole, there's a general decline in cognitive performance with aging. And we're all aware of that. Probably not somebody of your age, but certainly as we, as we hit our sort of middle age, kind of 50s, 60s, there's a noticeable decline. That's usually, it's just the main thing that happens is that there's a slowing. So with most cognitive tasks, there's something called a speed accuracy trade-off. I don't want to get too technical, but essentially you can be fast and maybe make a few errors, or you can take a bit more time over a task and be more accurate. So if you imagine you're just doing something like, in the lab, you might do something like cross out all of the E's in a bit of text. Yep. You could go really, really fast and you might miss some, or you could be very methodical and go through and make sure you scan every word, and that would be slow but accurate, as opposed to going fast and making a few errors. And essentially what happens during aging is we just slow down a bit. The number of cognitive errors we make is not really that high with aging. And so obviously, if we can look after our brain, then we will age successfully and make fewer cognitive errors. And it's also something that people feel very concerned about. Most people, if you list what they feel concerned about with aging, they will say, I'm worried about my mental function. I'm worried about my energy levels. And then, a few physical things like sort of obviously things like pain and falls, those sort of things. But right at the top of the list for most people, they will put their mental function. And then the other side of it is, it turns out that as a neat sort of shorthand, a lot of people who are researching this area, like myself, the shorthand is what's good for the heart is good for the brain.
Yeah.
So obviously, in the two big causes of death in Australia, for example, are heart disease and dementia. Dementia is number one in women. Heart disease, the last time I looked, was number one in men, but dementia is number two. So those are the two leading causes of deaths in Australia. And so if we can look after our heart and our brain, then people will age successfully. And that will have huge benefits for individuals, but also for society.
Yeah, and in aging successfully, or what we would say gracefully, right? People would do better life choices, but sometimes when we are younger, we tend to take these substances for fun, for immediate energy, like for example, coffee. So, in respect to our topic of the day, of how everyday substances may affect our neurocognition, what are some of the everyday substances that play a role in our brain function and aging?
Well, you mentioned coffee, and I guess why don't we start there, because that's an obvious one. It's the most commonly consumed or widely consumed psychoactive substance in the world. I think this is still the case. It certainly was a few years ago that it's the most traded commodity in the world after oil.
Ah,
So caffeine is a very important aspect of culture. Yeah, really throughout the world, even in certain cultures where, for example, alcohol is not consumed to the same level as it is in places like Europe and Australia, and so so caffeine is really interesting. Um, pardon me. So caffeine is really interesting. The way it works is that we have in our body, throughout the body, we have receptors for a substance called adenosine. Now, it doesn't really matter what it's called, but it happens to be called adenosine. So you've got this substance called adenosine, which accumulates during the day. And as it accumulates, it binds to these receptors. So, and this is often described as a key going into a lock. So we've got these thousands and thousands of locks, and then these keys come around and they bind to these adenosine receptors. And we've got, I don't know how many, but definitely thousands of different receptors for different molecules in the body. But adenosine is one of them. Adenosine comes along, it's a key, it goes into the lock. And the effect of that is that it increases what's called sleep pressure. So sleep pressure is essentially feeling tired, specifically not that physical fatigue from exercise, but kind of mental fatigue. And, that I'm sure we've all been there where you're trying to sort of stay awake and you just can't. And that's when that sleep pressure is really maxed out. And so adenosine is part of the kind of molecular cascade, if you like, which leads to us falling asleep. Okay. Now, what does caffeine do? Well, caffeine happens to physically, if you looked at the molecule itself, it looks structurally very like adenosine. So what happens is caffeine fits into the lock, but it's a bit like a broken key. You can't turn the lock. It doesn't increase sleep pressure. It just sort of sits there. But what it does do is it prevents adenosine, the sleepy molecule, if you like, getting into the lock. And so that's how caffeine works. It prevents the normal sleep pressure. So it makes you feel, particularly, as you were saying, first thing in the morning when you're maybe just a bit groggy from sleep or a bit drowsy, or during the day where you just need a pickup, it increases alertness. And this is it's very well established that this is how it works.
Indeed.
So, that's all well and good. The problem is, well, there are a couple of problems. One is that there's some evidence that repeated caffeine use can cause a kind of almost like a dependence. And so this idea is that we wake. I mean, it's not completely clear whether this is the case, and it's a little bit controversial. But there is a notion that what happens is you wake up in the morning, you're in a withdrawal state, and you drink your coffee or whatever, maybe you have your caffeine, and all that's doing is alleviating the withdrawal, and you're just performing then at the level that you would be if you'd never ever had caffeine. So what happens is with repeated use, you get this decline in performance, which then gets propped up by your morning coffee or whatever. So there's that. The other side of it is that caffeine is what we call a vasoconstrictor, which means it narrows blood vessels, which is, now the brain is extremely greedy. It's one of the greediest organs in the body. For most of us, it's about 2% of our body weight. And it's constantly churning away at 20-25% of our blood. Energy. Even when we're asleep, it's doing that. And so what we have is and that requires a very rich blood supply. So caffeine has a positive chemical effect. It has this effect on adenosine receptors. The net result of that is that it causes what's called physiological arousal in the brain. So there's an upregulation of certain chemicals in the brain which are involved with kind of waking up the brain. At the same time, it causes this restriction of blood vessels. Now, so that's a bad thing. The kind of chemistry wins out over the vasoconstriction. And so that's why, and I'm sure people will have experienced this, is when you have a little bit too much caffeine, you get this kind of tension, this almost agitation. That we think that is a feature or a function of this vasoconstriction of caffeine. Now, interestingly, there are certain molecules in nature which are vasodilators. So they have the opposite effect.
They open up.
So we were talking earlier about flavonoids. A lot of flavonoids actually cause this vasodilation, increase the sort of diameter of blood vessels.
It opens up the blood vessels pretty much.
It opens up the blood vessels. So that has a beneficial effect on health in general, because blood flow to the body is really good, but also to brain function. So if you're supplying more blood to this greedy organ where it can pull oxygen and glucose and other nutrients out of the blood, that's a good thing. And what's even more surprising, or maybe not, is that some of these goodies which cause vasodilation as opposed to vasoconstriction are found in caffeinated drinks. So tea has things called catechins in there. And the catechins are a class of molecules which cause vasodilation. Coffee has chlorogenic acids in it which cause this vasodilation. So there's whether we just choose to take caffeine in forms that have this kind of this physiological effect, maybe just be a coincidence, or it may be that in the past that's people sort of realize that they can maybe get away with a bit less caffeine when they've got these other molecules on board.
I see.
Sorry, that was a very long-winded answer to
That's
a very
wonderful
specific question.
because you did explain a lot in terms of how caffeine affects our blood vessels and how our brain thinks, and the whys that why did we get more attention after we drink too much caffeine or coffee. And we did also touch a little bit on flavonoids, which is a naturally occurring substance that we take in our body that has the adverse effect. And we did really talk a lot about cognition. But what is actually the primary function of cognition?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and it's almost it's almost a philosophical question, I think. So it's there is a question about why are we conscious? Why is consciousness developed? And particularly in humans, why have we developed things like language? And I think the answer is that particularly, I mean, cognition exists to some degree in all mammals at least, and maybe even sort of and certain invertebrates even. So we know that there's some aspects of cognition that exists throughout the animal kingdom. For humans, it's very specific in that we are pretty rubbish at most things. We're not the fastest, we're not the strongest, we're not the biggest, we're not very particularly good at foraging compared to some other animals. Our sense of smell's pretty crap compared to certain other animals. The one thing we have got is cognition. And so there's, again, it's not really known why humans have evolved to have such big brains, and specialized brains. It may be to do with bipedalism, walking
Looking.
upright.
Mhm.
It may be to do with something to do with the way that we sort of our gut works, etc. And there's certainly a cost to walking upright. But what it does mean is that we are smart. That might, looking at the news, that might not be obvious, but that's given us the ability to adapt incredibly well to pretty much every evolutionary niche there is. So humans exist in the deep jungle. They exist in the North Pole, and so the brain having cognition allows us to adapt. It allows us to interact with our environment in very specialized ways, and as social animals, of course, it allows us to interact with other humans in a meaningful way. And so, I think that's why cognition has evolved. And it's very interesting that, we are, I think, at the moment on the brink of artificial intelligence advances,
Yes.
which may, I'm not an expert in this, but certainly everyone will be aware that AI's been around, at least probably since there've been models of AI since you could argue from the 60s onwards. So whatever that is, sort of 60 years. But certainly in the last 2 years, there's been this absolute explosion in the capability of AI and large language models. Now, they're not quite acting like humans now, but that's probably going to allow us
Mhm.
to understand how cognition works much better. It's one very interesting approach, because if we can model human cognition, we'll gain a better understanding. Because, as I said earlier, the brain doesn't really give up its secrets easily. It's quite hard to study mental function. It's challenging, and I think a lot of us who work in neuroscience and cognition. We love that challenge, but I think we're living in interesting times in terms of that understanding.
Yeah, and being smart, sometimes sometimes it is quite difficult to understand that humans have the neurocognition ability other that other creatures do not have. And a lot of times we want to enhance these by drinking coffee to work better. And caffeine is found in a lot of drinks, and it's not only coffee, and people consume it on the daily basis. And how do we did talk a little bit on actually a lot on what coffee does to our body and the system and the brain and the veins, but how do various doses of caffeine affect cognitive functions like attention and the working memory?
Mm. Yeah, really good question. So, if let's think about what the doses actually are, maybe. So, even decaffeinated coffee has a little bit of caffeine, maybe sort of five. A cup of decaf has so between 5 and 10 milligrams. So that's each milligram is a thousandth of a gram, just to put that into perspective. A can of, say, cola has 40 milligrams. A can of Red Bull has 80.
Wow.
Most coffees have around 80 to 100.
Whoa.
One of the Starbucks has, I think, 150 or 200. So, those are the kind of ranges we're talking about. So the effects. There's one study I'm aware of that found improvements to performance on a very tedious, if you like, task. So this was press a button as quickly as possible when you get a signal that a star's about to appear on a computer screen, but going over a long period of time. And that found effects at 12.5 milligrams. That's very low. That's a quarter of a can of Coke. Most studies would suggest that the effects kick in at around sort of 40 or 50 milligrams, which is a can of Coke, a cup of tea, those sort of things. And then it gets really reliable when you get to around sort of 80 to 100 milligrams. So that's an espresso or a double espresso, a kind of standard mug of coffee or cup of coffee. And so those are the kind of amounts we're talking about. And then when we think about the kind of upper limit, most of the legislative bodies that regulate these things in North America and Europe suggest that the maximum that you should have on a daily basis is 400 milligrams. So that's four standard coffees, 4 or 5 standard coffees, 7 or 8 cups of tea, or whatever that is, 5 Red Bulls, 10 cans of Coke. So that's an absolute upper limit. Now, having said that, there are also a few variations. So some people have a genetic difference in their adenosine receptors. So that's it's not that common, but we've probably all encountered people who avoid caffeine because they get jittery and anxious, even if they ingest. Are you one?
I am. I get
Well, you've
jittery.
got okay. So you've got a mutation in your Adora gene,
Ah,
which is the genotype that affects your adenosine receptors. So and so there are a few people with
I
that.
see. So if someone gets like a bit too much from just a little bit of coffee, it's due to the mutation in their gene.
Yeah,
Oh, that's
yeah,
interesting.
yeah.
And what about the people who are not affected at all by caffeine?
Well, on for the most part, those are people who are heavy caffeine consumers who have desensitized their adenosine receptors.
I see. And as you mentioned, mine has a mutation on the Adora, but how does it affect the cognitive functions in terms of the my attention and the working
The
memory?
cognitive effects seem to be similar, but it's more this sort of precipitating anxiety. There's no not
Ah,
I'm certainly not aware of any evidence suggesting that that particular genotype is associated with any cognitive problems at all.
I see. And in general, how does caffeine in chewing gum? We did talk about the one in Red Bull, coffee, and tea. But what about in chewing gum? Does it also affect mood and cognitive performance, or is it similar in terms of caffeine?
Well, caffeine. I mean, chewing gums are just another delivery mechanism for caffeine. So you can take caffeine in, in gummies, in chewing
Hmm.
gum, in tablets, in drinks. Um, Chewing gum itself is an interesting phenomenon, and yeah, I've done a bit of research in this area. Probably
Ah,
one of the few people who has, only because I was many years ago was approached by um, a, an honor student looking for a project who said, yeah, some of my friends are telling me that when they chew gum, it helps them to focus. So they chew gum when they're studying for
yeah.
exams, and yeah, and I sort of said, oh, I mean, surely, that'll be well established. So I sort of looked it up on the sort of scientific databases of all the literature and about chewing gum and mental function, cognition, and there wasn't anything actually. I was really surprised. Looked on the Wrigley's website and was digging around, and turned out that nobody had actually tested this. So we set up a little experiment where a group of people chewed gum, a group of people didn't do anything, and then a group of people who thought, well, that's not. We need a group that's sort of doing something active, and so they what we called sham chewed. So they pretended they were sort of making the movements, but they didn't have anything in their mouths. And what we found was that the people who were chewing gum, they improved their memory.
Oh,
Uh, and in fact, there's been quite a few studies since now that have looked at this phenomenon. And actually, the main effect seems to be that it does improve alertness, which would lead to these improvements in concentration. And that's just through chewing gum. We don't. So it seems to have an effect on improving alertness, as I say, and also reducing
I
stress.
see. So it's mhm.
So yeah, so whether that's just that it's distracting, um, yeah, we don't really know, but it's an interesting phenomenon. And also, I should say that these are all, when we look at these sort of studies, we're talking about the mean effects. So you take a group of 50 people, and on average, their alertness improves or their stress reduces. But within those 50, there'll be some people where it has no
I
effect,
see.
some people where it
So
has.
it's
Yeah,
more so the caffeine is similar to the effect of coffee and other and others, and it's more to the effect of the action of chewing the gum itself. That is quite interesting.
it seems to be. Yeah. So there's a little bit of work looking at blood flow to the brain during chewing, and it turns out that you do increase blood flow to the brain.
Oh,
So, and so it may be that it's secondary to that. Yeah, we don't really know what the underlying mechanism is, but yeah, it's just an interesting sort of,
it is
little finding.
interesting. And uh, let's talk about alcohol, which is another substance that a lot of people consume on the daily basis. In fact, between 2022 and 2023, alcohol was the most common drug of concern for which people received treatment in Australia, making out, 43% treatment episodes provided. What effect would regular and prolonged alcohol consumption have on brain health and cognitive longevity?
So, yeah, I mean, unsurprisingly, long-term heavy alcohol consumption is very bad for the brain. There's a type of dementia called Korsakoff syndrome, which is very often the result of alcohol consumption. We get this large, you can, by eye, you can look at the post-mortem of a sort of alcoholic's drink and a non-drinker's, an alcoholic's brain and a non-drinker's brain, and you can physically see the kind of shrinkage. Alcohol is a toxin, so you get a lot of what's a kind of inflammatory response to alcohol. So I think there's three aspects. There's that kind of long-term health, general health degeneration, where the liver can't detoxify the body quickly enough. The liver kind of degenerates. There's people will probably be aware of the gut-brain axis.
Yes.
There's also a liver-brain axis, which is
Ah,
important for some aspects as well. And so you get that kind of long-term just damage of basically most tissue, but that includes the brain. There's the effect of alcohol intoxication itself. So we talked about briefly earlier about the frontal cortex and the prefrontal
yes.
cortex. Now, one of the roles of the prefrontal cortex is that it we have areas of the brain, one area called the limbic system. The limbic system is involved in things like that are to do with survival, so fight or flight, sexual behaviors, feeding, and so sometimes called all the F's sometimes, but it's so, and this is sort of very important for survival. But normally, of course, this is sort of kept in check, so you wouldn't sort of suddenly, even if you were hungry and you were walking past a restaurant, you wouldn't just go in there and sort of just take the food off somebody's plate, for example. The frontal cortex is kind of inhibiting those drives for survival. So food, sex, fighting, if you feel like you're being threatened in any way. One thing that alcohol does is it shuts, or it starts to shut down the frontal cortex. So that inhibition of those kind of more survival-based behaviors is removed. So you sort of take the brakes off to some degree. It's not a kind of binary on-off thing, but you inhibit it. And so what that leads to is what's called sometimes called alcohol myopia, which is where people are much more interested in the immediate rewards of their situation rather than the longer term consequences. So, and this is risky sex, maybe eating that kind of souvlaki or something, kebabs in the UK on the way home if you're drunk, or being disinhibited in what you're saying to people. So this is all to do with alcohol intoxication shutting down that part of the brain that normally reins those things in. So that's longer term and immediate effects of intoxication. And then there's another aspect, which is something that I've researched quite a bit over the years, which is alcohol hangover. So alcohol hangover is an interesting one because this is, people will have experienced it. It's a sort of lethargy, etc. Alcohol hangover is defined as the kind of cluster of symptoms which occur when, after a bout of drinking, when blood alcohol levels are back at zero or at least approaching zero. And so what's interesting is during the hangover state, we're impaired, we're cognitively impaired.
Yes.
And so if you put somebody on a driving simulator when they are hungover, their performance on driving is as bad as if they're over the drink driving limit. So, but if if somebody was driving poorly because of a hangover and they were pulled over by the police and breathalyzed, their blood alcohol would probably show 0. So it's a real problem. And we don't have a very good biomarker for alcohol hangover. But what we do know is that it costs the economy a huge amount. So the CDC did an analysis about, I think it was published in 2000, might be 10 years ago now, or 8 or 10 years ago, which estimated that alcohol hangover costs the US economy something like $270 billion a year. So it's huge. And this is people taking a sick day, or so being absent, or also this thing presenteeism, which is where people are at work, but they're just not performing. So if you cost all of the sort of, the small individual effects of that on the whole economy, is very, very costly, and is probably also a good indicator of what of poor health as well, because this repeated inflammatory response which occurs following alcohol consumption probably precipitates certain inflammatory diseases later in life, which could include certain forms of cognitive decline, mental health problems,
I see.
etc. Yeah.
And with alcohol, usually smoking goes hand in hand. And how does nicotine impact reaction times and attention, particularly in relation to substance-related cues?
So nicotine itself is actually not a terrible drug, other than it being addictive. So nicotine actually speeds up reaction times
Oh.
and improves cognitive performance. We have receptors. Well, I talked about receptors in the context of caffeine and adenosine. We also have receptors in the brain called nicotinic receptors. They're called nicotinic receptors because they were discovered because they bind nicotine. And so if somebody smokes, they inhale nicotine, and nicotine is binding these receptors within 7 seconds, flooding the brain with nicotine. And nicotine itself is addictive, but the main problem is, because it's addictive, if nicotine is mixed with things like tobacco smoke, that's really harmful. Tobacco smoke contains hundreds of carcinogens, and so tobacco is more harmful than nicotine, but nicotine itself causes people to inhale more smoke, for example. Somebody who takes nicotine, as a tablet, which you can do, is probably doing okay. Vaping was used, and e-cigarettes were sort of sold as a way of trying to reduce tobacco use. And certainly if e-cigarettes are used in that context for a heavy smoker to try and switch to another way of getting nicotine, they're probably okay. But if people start vaping, particularly in adolescence, that can have lots of very harmful effects.
I see.
So this so-called popcorn lung, which is being discovered in people who are using vapes. So in terms of nicotine's effects on brain function, it's kind of okay in that it does improve cognitive performance and mental performance. But again, like with other substances, you need more and more of it over time to get the same benefit as when you first take it. And so from that point of view, it's not good. But it's certainly nowhere near as bad as tobacco smoke.
I see. So it's like how the body has increased the immunity. So we we would need to take more nicotine to get the initial effect of that?
Yeah. So what happens is that we have, as I said, these receptors called nicotinic receptors. They bind one of the neurotransmitters, one of the chemicals in the brain called acetylcholine. And what happens is because they get bombarded with nicotine, they become less sensitive because the brain is very adaptive. It tries to maintain a balance. So if the brain is getting a lot of binding of one particular chemical, it will tend to sort of shut down the reaction to some degree. And so you need more and more of it. So from that perspective, and that's how, for example, heroin addiction works in a very similar way. So what I'm saying, the way I'm describing that is very kind of reductive, and obviously it's much more complex
Indeed,
than that.
definitely.
That's a sort of simple way of thinking about it.
Talking about our age and longevity, how do factors like age and frequency of use influence the neurocognitive effects of these substances in the long run?
Yeah. So it's not necessarily age itself, but it's because age is associated with time, and time allows more use and a cumulative effect. And so if somebody, for example, there's absolutely no question that if somebody has started, say, smoking in, as an adolescent, or using alcohol as an adolescent, and is continuing to use those substances heavily into old age, there's an accumulation of negative effects. And so if somebody is using them who's older, that is going to have a negative effect and will definitely precipitate cognitive decline.
And all in all, are there any potential cognitive benefits to moderate consumption of maybe certain substances, or are the risks always greater?
Um, yeah, that's an interesting one. There was an idea that low levels of alcohol consumption might benefit cardiovascular
Mm,
health. I think most of that early, it's called the French paradox, if you've heard of it. So
yeah.
there was this idea that in certain areas of France, people consumed, sort of lots of kind of fatty foods with French cuisine, but maybe smoked. I mean, it's a bit of a cliche, I
Mm-hmm.
guess. This, I don't want to sort of push any stereotypes, but also this idea that the red wine consumption was protecting them because
Yes, yes.
heart disease and heart attacks seem to be at a lower rate than equivalent people who were not drinking the red wine in other societies. I think it's been pretty much debunked. That there, I think that some studies have shown this, sometimes called a kind of hockey stick graph, where you get a kind of little bit of protection at low levels of consumption, and then it shoots right up as you consume more, as people consume more and more at the population level. So I always say this: there's a little bit of evidence that consuming a small amount of wine, which is maybe we're talking about 100 mils a day,
Mm-hmm.
not when you think that what's a bottle of wine, 750, so close, well, basically you wouldn't even be drinking a whole bottle over a week. But and I sometimes talk about this at conferences, and I always sort of caveat it with if you don't drink, please don't start drinking small amounts of alcohol because you think it might protect your brain or your heart, because it won't. Or pretty much every study that's come out over the last sort of decade has shown that absolute abstinence is better than any
I
alcohol.
see. So in the end, abstinent is better, and that the risks are actually greater in the scheme of the current research and the medical scene.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, there's also I mean, yeah. So it's that's right. I mean, I think if people are if people are sort of drinking within the recommended amounts, then they shouldn't worry too much, obviously. But if you don't drink, please don't start drinking because you think it's going to be good for your brain or heart.
I see. And that's a very in-depth discussion in terms of neurocognitive functions and the substances that we take on a day-to-day basis. And in terms of practices and habits, what habit would you recommend practicing to maintain our neurocognitive functions or our brain health?
Um, there are so many, but it's the usual suspects. Exercise,
Aerobic.
get out into nature. I think that's there's a lot of benefits for getting into green space if you can, going for a walk. The two main ones are exercise and diet. So we talked earlier about vegetables, eating the rainbow, getting
Flavonoids, right?
these flavonoids into you, vitamins, oily fish a few days a week. Look at
Fatty
Mediterranean
acids.
diet
Yeah.
or something similar to that. Exercise. So those are the two main ones. But then there's also evidence that rest can be just doing nothing almost can be really good. There's a fantastic book called The Art of Rest by Dr. Claudia Hammond. And she sort of does a really very forensic investigation of all the literature on things like what people do to rest. And even, I don't want to sort of recommend any of these things, but things like watching TV for some people is very restful and quite a social activity, sort of, it's not this, obviously there's a sort of part of it can be just being glued to, to one sort of program, and perhaps not, doing that at, and ignoring other important things. But there's also this idea that for some people it's the time when they socialize, and there's been a lot of work showing that certainly when families watch TV together, a bit like what's it called? Goggle box, this idea that actually there's a little bit of social activity going on when people watch TV programs, together. Rest for some people can be going for a run, counterintuitively, but that idea that even though you're doing some quite strenuous physical activity, for some people, they find that really relaxing. For some people, it's reading. And again, this sort of idea that, you're allowing your brain to almost not exactly switch off, but I'm sure we've all had this experience where you're reading the passage of a book and you're sort of going through, or Kindle, I guess, these days, or whatever device we use, and you go through and you're sort of flicking the pages, and you might, go through several paragraphs or several pages, and then suddenly you realize, I literally haven't been taking any of this in. So what's going on there? You're obviously attending to it. You're paying attention because when you've reached the end of a page.
Yeah.
But there's this kind of very automatic thing going on, and that is this mind-wandering aspect, which is really important for the brain. So it's really important sometimes just to do nothing. And the reason is that there's these sort of hubs in the brain that switch on called the default mode network, it's called. But it's basically the thing that kicks in when we just mind wander. People who are, sort of monks who do this kind of daily meditation have, their default mode network is exceptional. And when we rest, we kick into this default mode network, and it seems to have, nobody's really sure exactly why yet, but it seems to have these really important health benefits.
Meditation.
For us.
I see.
Yeah. And for some people, it's just sitting and thinking. For some people, it's meditation. For some people, it's reading. For some people, it's going for the activities that help you to just clear your head, or sometimes just relax. So, something like taking a bath for some people is the thing that, gets them into this state of just thinking about nothing in particular, and helping that default mode
I
network to
see.
switch on.
So
So that's another important one.
yeah,
Yeah,
so relaxing is actually one important part of
very
the
important.
cognitive function and actually can improve it, because a lot of people think that if I'm not being productive, I'm I'm doing nothing, I'm not being productive.
Yeah, I mean it's crazy because there's so many studies showing that really people can't be productive for 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. It's probably even that's probably too much. So this kind of fetishization of
Overworking.
overworking is really very unhealthy.
All right. Thank you very much on telling us on what should we do in terms of our brain function. I think that also correlates to our whole holistic longevity in the end, because what you mentioned was exercise, food, rest, and especially clearing our minds, which not a lot of people do nowadays. And now we can get into our next segment, which is called Open Mic segment. And here you can talk about any topic that you are interested about. So the stage is yours, Andrew.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I thought a little bit about this, and I'm going to talk about two things: one sort of general and one specific. So I'll start with the general, which is I think as a scientist at the moment, we live in a culture where we have to be very careful about where we get our evidence base from,
Mhm.
and I think this is sort of really brought home to me. We were just watching the apple cider vinegar Netflix thing about Mel Gibson, but I think there are a lot of um, social media influencers who are pushing certain um, health advice for their
Yeah.
followers when there is zero evidence base. And I think as scientists, I think we're really up against it because there is um, a lot of very bad health information out there, and I certainly see it in the context of brain health. So I would really urge anyone, if anyone does listen to me on this, is just to check your sources and try and understand, where the good science comes from.
Mm,
Okay,
okay.
so that's the first thing.
This.
The second
Mhm.
one is very specific, and I for full disclosure, I want to be very transparent here. We mentioned this before the podcast. I'm chief scientific officer of a small a company in New Zealand called Arepa, and the reason I work with them is just for a few hours every week is just they are developing evidence-based drinks for brain health. And so the hero ingredient in this product, Arepa, is called Neuroberry. It's a New Zealand blackcurrant,
Ah,
and
blackcurrant.
we've known for a little while that consuming this juice and the Arepa products increases levels of dopamine and serotonin, which are the kind of two neurotransmitters that probably people listening or watching this podcast will have heard of. And this is this was known well before I had anything to do with it, but this is why I sort of helped the company to develop these evidence-based brain health drinks. And what we know is that they improve, let's talk about dopamine levels, because they inhibit the enzyme that breaks down dopamine. So when the way that a lot of these chemical reactions work is that there's this constant churn where the brain is producing dopamine, and then as soon as it's produced, it's gobbled up by these enzymes, and that this process is going on, this sort of churn. And what happens is the enzyme that does the breaking down is called monoamine oxidase.
Mhm.
Yep. But we know that within these products, there's something which acts as a monoamine oxidase inhibitor. So big words. MAO inhibitors are things which help to maintain the levels of dopamine and serotonin.
Ah.
Yep. So this is a blackcurrant, which when people sort of just drink, a few, sort of cupful or two of the juice, is propping up their dopamine. And last year, the company sponsored some work where they tried to discover what was responsible for this effect. So what is the actual nutrient or the individual molecule within the blackcurrant that has this effect? It's not all blackcurrants, by the way, but certainly the ones that are used in Arepa has this effect. And I had a hunch what I thought it was. So did some of the other researchers. And it was almost like, it'll be this, it'll be beta-carbolines, it'll be one of the anthocyanins in there. And we were all wrong. So there was none of the things that we thought, but some really meticulous work. Again, I had nothing to do with this, but by some scientists in New Zealand, where they kind of broke down all the individual components and tested them for this effect, and then found, okay, it's one of this group of molecules. So we'll then separate them out further until we get to individual molecules and test them to see if they prevent the breakdown of dopamine. Discovered a new molecule, or at least a new molecule in this context, called sarmentosine. And we now know that within these Arepa products, there's this newly discovered molecule called sarmentosine. It's not newly discovered as a molecule, but it's the first time that it's been shown that this molecule can prevent the breakdown of dopamine. I just say that because that kind of research is outside of the kind of things that I've got any experience in at all. And it's not very often in a scientist's career that they actually are involved, however peripherally. It's not very often in the scientist's career that they are involved, however peripherally, in something as exciting as that kind of discovery.
Yeah.
So that's my message.
That's really impactful work that you're doing, Andrew. And if our listeners want to find out more about you and what you do, where should they go?
I've got a website called andrewscholey.com. So there you can find links to my Twitter account, or whatever it's called these days.
X.
And the rest of it, I'm a very, what should I say? I'm not a heavy user of social media, but I do occasionally post on there. And certainly if people are interested in anything I've talked about, I'm usually, I'm very happy to sort of answer emails and, or any other messages that come my way. So andrewscholey.com.
Okay, Andrew, thank you very much for sharing and informing people where they can find you. And it was such a pleasant moment having you here in the podcast and talking to you. And for our listeners, thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I enjoyed that.
You have been listening to Aging Less, the Longevity Science Insights podcast produced by LMSL, the Life Management Science Labs. More episodes are available from 10 life management perspectives and can be found by searching LMSL on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and other podcasting apps available on your devices. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, share, and subscribe to our channel so that other people can find it and we can continue to provide quality content. More of our work can be found on our website at longevity.lifemanagementsciencelabs.com, where you can join our movement. I'm Marie Stella. Thanks for tuning in.